My name is Marcus Holloway. I'm 34 years old, and every person in Harlan, Kentucky knew how my little brother really died. Every single one of them. The woman who cut my hair, the man who sold me brake pads at the auto store, the couple who sat behind my mother at Eli's funeral and held her while she shook. They all knew, and for 11 years, not one of them said a word. Eli was 16. He sang in the youth choir at Ridgecrest Baptist. He was the kid who organized the canned food drives every November, who helped the older ladies carry groceries to their cars after Wednesday service. Everybody loved him. Everybody said he'd go far. And everybody in that congregation watched Pastor Leland Greer stand at the pulpit 2 days after my brother's casket went into the ground, and they listened to him call it God's plan, and they nodded. I found out the truth in the fall of 2023. I was pulling old wiring out of the church basement during a renovation, and I found a notebook that burned every lie that town had told me for over a decade. Last November, I stood in front of 114 people who'd spent 11 years lying to my face, and I made sure they heard every word. Pastor Greer was sitting in the front row. He couldn't leave, and he couldn't look at me. If you want to hear how a whole town stayed quiet about a dead kid and what happened the night the silence broke, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. I think some of you already know which side you're on. Tell me in the comments before you even hear the rest, wherever you're watching from. Let's see who changes their mind by the end. It started in the fall of 2013. October. I was 23, still working my first year as a licensed electrician out of my uncle's shop on Route 421. Harlan's the kind of place where you know everybody's truck by sound. You know who's having a bad week by how they hold their coffee at Brenda's Diner on Monday morning. My family had been there 4 generations. Holloways built the first bridge over Clover Fork back in 1923. That mattered in Harlan. Your name carried weight, or it didn't. Eli was, look, I'm biased. He was my kid brother, but he was just one of those people. 11 years old and already volunteering at the food pantry without being asked. By 16, he was leading the youth group's Appalachian outreach trips, loading canned goods into the church van every other weekend, and driving up to Pine Mountain with Pastor Greer's oldest son riding shotgun. The church van. A white 2004 Ford Econoline that Ridgecrest had bought used from a dealership in Middlesboro. That van is where this whole story lives and dies. On October 19, 2013, Eli and 7 other kids piled into that van for a service trip to a community center in Everts. 14 miles. Pastor Greer's wife was supposed to drive, but she had a migraine, so the youth group director, a guy named Dorsey Pruitt, took the wheel instead. They loaded up after Saturday morning practice, pulled out of the church lot around 10:15. The road to Everts runs through a stretch called Bailey's Grade. If you've never driven it, it's a 2-lane mountain road with a 30-foot drop on the right side and no guardrail for about a quarter mile. You learn that road young in Harlan. You respect it. The van didn't make the curve at the bottom of Bailey's Grade. It went through the gravel shoulder, hit a drainage ditch, and rolled twice before stopping on its roof in the creek bed. 6 kids walked away with cuts and broken bones. One girl, Tessa Burgess, fractured her pelvis and spent 4 months in a wheelchair. And Eli was sitting in the back row on the right side. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt because the latch on that seat had been broken for months. He was ejected on the second roll. He died at Harlan ARH Hospital at 2:47 that afternoon. The official report said driver error. Dorsey Pruitt lost control on wet pavement. That was the story. The sheriff signed off on it. The church held a vigil. Pastor Greer delivered the most moving eulogy I'd ever heard. I remember my mother grabbing my hand during it, squeezing so hard her knuckles went white. And life in Harlan moved on. Because that's what Harlan does. Dorsey Pruitt left town 3 weeks after the crash. Just gone. Packed his apartment on a Tuesday, drove away Wednesday morning before sunrise. Nobody threw him a going away. Nobody even mentioned it at church the following Sunday. One day the youth group had a director, and the next day they didn't. At the time, I was so deep in grief I barely noticed. My mother, Rhonda Holloway, stopped going to church for about 6 months after Eli died. She didn't stop believing in God. She told me that once, sitting on her porch in the dark. She just couldn't sit in that building and look at the choir section where Eli used to stand. I understood that. I was the same way. But here's what I didn't understand until much later. I'd visit my mother on Sundays and she'd tell me about people who stopped by the house. Neighbors, church members, women she'd known for decades. And every visit ended the same way. They'd hug her, they'd say, "God has a plan," and they'd leave. Nobody ever said anything about the van. Nobody ever said anything about what really happened on Bailey's grade. I thought that was grief. I thought people just didn't know what to say. That's what I told myself for 11 years. I kept working, built my career, got my master electrician license in 2016 and started my own shop, Holloway Electric, on Central Street. 3 employees by 2019. Harlan was good to me professionally. The Holloway name opened doors. I wasn't rich, but I was established. And I kept going to Ridgecrest Baptist. Pastor Greer baptized me when I was 12. He married my cousin. He visited my grandmother in the hospital the week she died and sat with my family for 4 hours. In a town like Harlan, your pastor isn't just a preacher. He's family. He's the man you trust with your worst moments. Leland Greer was 58 years old, silver-haired, always wore pressed khaki pants with a button down even on his day off. The kind of guy who shook your hand and you felt it in your shoulder. Everybody in Harlan deferred to him. If there was a town council dispute or a disagreement between neighbors, someone would say, "What does Pastor Greer think?" And that usually settled it. He ran Ridgecrest Baptist for 26 years, 340 members, the biggest congregation in the county, and the building was his pride. He'd spent a decade fundraising for an expansion, a new fellowship hall, a proper youth wing, updated classrooms. By 2013, they had about $127,000 in the building fund. I know that number because it was on a thermometer poster in the church lobby. I walked past it every Sunday. So when Eli died and the town closed ranks and life moved forward, I thought I understood the shape of what happened. A terrible accident, a driver who lost control, a family that lost a boy. I was wrong about everything, but I wouldn't know that for another 11 years. In September 2023, Ridgecrest hired me to rewire the church basement. The original wiring was knob and tube from 1961, and the insurance company had finally flagged it. $14,200 job. Took me and my crew about 3 weeks. It was during the second week that I found the notebook. I was pulling old wire from behind a junction box in the storage room at the back of the basement. There's a gap between the wall and the electrical panel, maybe 4 inches. Something fell when I pulled the wire. I heard it hit the concrete. I reached down and pulled out a spiral notebook. Blue cover, water-stained, about the size of a paperback. The kind you'd buy at Dollar General for 90 cents. I opened it. The first page said, "Van Log, Ridgecrest Baptist Youth Ministry," in neat handwriting. Dated entries starting January 2012. I didn't understand what I was reading at first. It was a maintenance log. Oil changes, tire pressure checks, mileage records, normal stuff. But then I got to the entries from August 2013, 2 months before the crash. August 14th, 2013. Right rear brake making grinding sound. Told Pastor G. He said budget won't cover it until after the building fund presentation in November. We'll monitor. August 29th, 2013. Brake issue worse. Passengers can feel pulling on right turns. Told Pastor G again. He said use the other church vehicle for long trips. Short trips only for the van. September 22nd, 2013. Used van for Everett's supply run. Brakes very soft on Bailey's grade. Almost missed the turn at the bottom. I'm not comfortable driving this vehicle with passengers. October 11th, 2013. 8 days before the crash. Told Pastor G I will not drive the van with youth passengers until brakes are fixed. He said he would take care of it. Asked if I'd told anyone else. I said no. The handwriting was Dorsey Pruitt's, the youth group director, the man who'd been driving the van the day my brother died. I sat on the basement floor for, 5 minutes, 10. I just sat there with that notebook open on my knees. My hands weren't shaking. That's the part that scared me. I was completely still, and for maybe 30 seconds I thought, this is it. I can walk into the sheriff's office right now and hand them this notebook and it'll be over. Then I thought about who signed the original accident report. No inspection, no brake check, just driver error and a signature. That hope lasted about a minute. Now, at this point, I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't have a plan. I had a notebook with 4 entries that said the pastor knew the van's brakes were failing and sent kids out in it anyway. But I also had 11 years of trusting this man, 11 years of listening to him preach about honesty and accountability every Sunday morning while he knew. I want to stop here for a second, because that moment, sitting on a concrete floor in a church basement, holding a dead man's handwriting that proves the person you trusted most let your brother die, I don't think you can prepare for that. Have you ever found something that completely destroyed the story you'd been telling yourself about someone you loved? A letter? A message? A document that turned a person you trusted into someone you didn't recognize? If that's happened to you, tell me in the comments. Because what that moment does to you, it doesn't just change what you know, it changes who you've been. And I was about to find out that this notebook was only the beginning. I thought about Dorsey Pruitt first, because the official story was driver error. Dorsey lost control on wet pavement, but if the brakes were failing, and Dorsey told the pastor, and the pastor did nothing, then Dorsey didn't lose control of anything. The van was already broken before he turned the key, and Dorsey left town 3 weeks later, just disappeared. So my first thought was, Dorsey knew, Dorsey panicked, Dorsey ran. And my second thought was, I need to find him. I spent 2 weeks looking for Dorsey Pruitt. Started with his old phone number, disconnected since 2015. His landlord said Dorsey left no forwarding address, paid his last month in cash, and was gone before the lease was up. I drove to his parents' old place in Loyal. A neighbor told me his father had passed in 2017 and his mother moved to Lexington. I found a number for the sister. She picked up, listened to me say my name, and said, Dorsey doesn't want to be found, and hung up. Dead end after dead end. The man had been gone for a decade, and it was like he'd evaporated. I'd known Dorsey since he started at Ridgecrest in 2011. Quiet, earnest, the kind of guy who wore a youth group t-shirt every day of the week. He loved those kids. I remember him and Eli arguing about basketball in the church parking lot. He wasn't a bad man. I knew that in my gut. But I kept thinking, he drove the van. He knew the brakes were bad. He drove it anyway. And then he left. I found him through a Facebook account his sister maintained from Lexington. He was living in Terre Haute, Indiana, working at a Home Depot. I got his number from a mutual contact and called him on a Wednesday night in October. He picked up on the 4th ring. I said, Dorsey, it's Marcus Holloway from Harlan. And there was this silence, maybe 5 seconds. Then he said, I've been waiting for this call for 11 years. I drove to Terre Haute that Friday, 4.5 hours. Dorsey met me at a Waffle House off I-70. He looked different, thinner, older than he should have at 42. He was wearing a Home Depot vest with his name tag still on. He wouldn't look at me when he sat down. He ordered coffee and wrapped both hands around the mug and he said, I need you to know that I tried to stop it. And here's what he told me. He didn't say it clean like I'm about to lay it out. He started with the crash. He said, the brakes were gone, Marcus. I felt them go at the top of the grade and I pumped them and nothing happened and He stopped, gripped the mug so hard his knuckles were white, looked at the wall behind me and said, I hear that sound every night. The sound of the van leaving the road. I hear it every single night. Then he circled back. He'd been reporting the brake issue to Pastor Greer since August. 4 written entries plus at least 6 verbal mentions. Greer kept pushing it off. The building fund presentation was coming up in November, and every dollar the church had was going toward the expansion. The van brake repair estimate from Boyd's Auto in Harlan was $1,800. Greer said they couldn't spare it. Dorsey said he told Greer on October 11th that he refused to drive the van with passengers. Greer told him he'd handle it. 2 days later, Greer's wife was supposed to drive the Everts trip. When she got a migraine that Saturday morning, Greer called Dorsey at 9:30 a.m. and told him he needed to drive. Dorsey said he reminded Greer about the brakes. Greer said, Dorsey, it's 14 miles of flat road. You'll be fine. These kids are counting on us. flat road. Bailey's grade is a mountain switchback with a 30-foot drop. The man had driven it 100 times. He knew exactly what that road was. Dorsey drove because his pastor told him to, and the brakes gave out at the bottom of the grade. $1,800. That's what my brother's life was worth. You ever have that moment where you realize the story you've been telling yourself, the one that helped you sleep at night, was completely wrong? Not just wrong in one detail, but wrong in its bones. I sat across from Dorsey Pruitt in that Waffle House, and I felt the entire framework of what I believed about my brother's death just collapse. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't driver error. It was a $1,800 repair that a pastor decided his building fund couldn't afford. And Dorsey, after the crash, after Eli died, Pastor Greer came to Dorsey's apartment. This was 3 days after the funeral. Greer sat in Dorsey's kitchen and told him that if the brake issue came out, it wouldn't just destroy the church, it would destroy the families. Every parent who'd ever put their child in that van would know. The lawsuits would bankrupt the congregation. The building fund, 26 years of donations, would be gone, and Dorsey would be charged with vehicular manslaughter. Dorsey said Greer looked him in the eyes and said, "This was a tragedy, Dorsey. God allowed it for reasons we can't understand. But if you talk about those brakes, you won't just be hurting yourself, you'll be hurting every family in this church." 3 weeks later, Dorsey was gone. Greer paid for his moving costs. I found that out later. $2,400 in cash, the price of a man's silence and a new start in Indiana. I'd been looking at Dorsey as the guilty one, the false trail, the man who ran. But Dorsey didn't run from guilt. He was pushed out by a pastor who needed him gone before anyone asked questions. It was a Sunday morning, maybe a week after I got back from Terre Haute. I was walking through the Ridgecrest parking lot toward my truck. I hadn't been inside. I'd stopped going to services by then, but I'd driven out there almost on autopilot, old habit. Pastor Greer was standing by the side entrance, shaking hands with people as they left. He saw me, and something in his face tightened for just a second. Then the smile came back. He walked over, put his hand on my shoulder. "Marcus, good to see you. We've missed you on Sundays." I said something about being busy with work. He nodded, but he didn't let go of my shoulder. "Your mother mentioned you've been focused on the past lately, going through old things." His voice was gentle, concerned, the voice he used when he sat with widows. "Marcus, I worry about you. Grief can make us see things that aren't there. It can take a man who's doing well, good business, solid reputation, and pull him backward into places that don't have anything left to give." He squeezed my shoulder, smiled. "Eli's at peace. Let him rest." I said, "Yes, sir," and got in my truck. My hands were shaking before I cleared the parking lot. When I got back to Harlan, I didn't go home. I drove straight to my mother's house. It was almost midnight on a Friday. The porch light was on. She always left it on for me, even though I hadn't lived there since I was 21. I sat in her kitchen and I told her everything. The notebook, Dorsey, the brakes, what Greer said. My mother is a strong woman. She raised 2 boys alone after my father died in a mining accident in 2001. She doesn't break easily, but I watched her face change as I talked. Not sadness, something harder than sadness, something that had been buried under 11 years of God's plan and casserole deliveries and Sunday mornings sitting in that same church where the man who killed her son stood behind the pulpit. She didn't cry. She just sat there for a long time. Then she said, "Marcus, I need to tell you something." She'd suspected. Not the specifics, not the breaks, not the notebook, but she'd felt something wrong in the weeks after Eli's funeral. The way people spoke to her, too careful, too soft, like they were managing her instead of grieving with her. She said she asked Pastor Greer once, maybe 6 months after Eli died, if there was anything about the accident that she should know. And Greer put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Rhonda, you've been through enough. Don't go looking for more pain." That sentence. I keep going back to it. Don't go looking for more pain. He said that to a mother who lost her 16-year-old son, while he knew exactly why her son was dead. I laughed. I don't know why. This short, ugly sound that came out of me before I could stop it. The man who killed my brother told my mother not to look for pain. The absurdity of it. It just hit me and I couldn't hold it in. My mother looked at me and I think she understood, because her mouth did this thing that was almost a smile, but not quite. So now I had a choice. I had the notebook. I had Dorsey's account. I had my mother's memory of Greer deflecting her one question. And I had a town of 340 congregation members who had either known the truth, suspected it, or been trained to look the other way. And I was afraid. I'll say that plainly. Not afraid of Greer, afraid of what pushing this would cost. Holloway Electric had 3 employees and 6 active contracts, 2 with Ridgecrest-connected families. My mother had finally found stability. If I blew this open, I could lose the business, turn my family into the people who destroyed the church instead of the ones who lost a boy. I knew how Harlan worked. The Holloway name opened doors, but it could also close them. But at night, when I couldn't sleep, I kept seeing Eli. Not the way he died, the way he lived. Loading canned goods into that van on Saturday mornings, singing off-key in the choir section, making his green bean casserole for every church potluck because he'd learned the recipe from our grandmother, and he was so proud of it. I wanted him to be more than a line on an accident report that lied about how he died. I wanted someone to say his name and mean the truth. I want to pause here for a second, because I know some of you have been in a situation where someone you trusted, someone who was supposed to protect you, turned out to be the one causing the harm. And the worst part isn't the harm itself. It's the moment you realize how long it was happening while you were trusting them. If that's you, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear your story. I drove home. Grief was gone. What I felt in that truck was rage, clean and cold and perfectly still. My mother was back there in her kitchen with 11 years of managed silence sitting on her shoulders, and the man who put it there had called it God's plan. Because what I found out next made everything I'd learned so far look small. The notebook was just the beginning. Pastor Greer's church insurance had lapsed 6 weeks before the crash, and he knew. I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I do best, following wires. When you're an electrician, your whole job is tracing connections. Which wire goes where? Which circuit feeds which outlet? You pull one wire and you find out what's connected to it. I pulled the insurance wire first. The church's liability coverage was through a company called Pinnacle Faith Insurance out of Nashville. I called their customer service line on a Monday morning and said I was a church board member requesting policy history for Ridgecrest Baptist. The woman on the phone told me the policy had been active from 2008 through August 31st, 2013, and had not been renewed. It lapsed on September 1st. The crash happened October 19th. 6 weeks without coverage. The annual premium was $4,100. That was the number. Pastor Greer chose to let a $4,100 insurance policy lapse and redirect the money to his building fund while children were riding in a van with failing brakes. I called the Harlan County Clerk's office next, requested the accident report from October 19th, 2013, case number 13-HC-4471. The report was 5 pages. Driver error, wet conditions, speed estimated at 35 miles per hour in a 25 zone, no mention of mechanical failure, no mention of brake condition, no inspection of the vehicle after the crash, no inspection. A van rolled twice, ejected a 16-year-old boy, and nobody checked the brakes. I called Boyd's Auto, the shop Dorsey mentioned in the notebook, asked for Boyd Creech. The woman who answered said Boyd was out on a job and wouldn't be back until Thursday. I left my number. He didn't call back. I called again Friday. Same thing. I drove to the shop the following Monday and found Boyd in the service bay underneath a Chevy Silverado. He slid out, looked at me and said, "I know who you are. I know what you're asking about, and I don't want trouble with the church." I told him I wasn't there to make trouble. I just needed to know what he knew. He looked at the door of his shop like he was checking if anyone was watching. And then he said, and I wrote this down, "I told Leland Inn, I think it was July of 2013, that those brakes were going to be a problem if he didn't get them looked at. He brought the van in for an oil change and I told him the pads were almost gone. He said he'd schedule it. He'd never scheduled it. Boyd checked his records. 3 oil changes and 1 tire rotation between 2010 and 2013. 0 brake work. July. 3 months before the crash. A mechanic told him. The youth group director told him. The man had every warning in the world, and he chose the building fund. If this story has hit you so far, take 2 seconds and hit subscribe. That's all I'm asking. Now, here's where it gets complicated. I had the notebook. I had the insurance lapse. I had Boyd's statement. I had Dorsey and Terre Haute ready to talk. For about a day, I felt like I was building something unstoppable. Every wire I pulled connected to another wire, and every connection pointed back to Greer. Then I started asking questions around town. Carefully. I didn't show anyone the notebook. I just talked to people, asked if they remembered anything about the crash. And what I got back was this wall. This polite, smiling, impenetrable wall. Brenda Goines at the diner said, "Oh, honey, that was such a long time ago. Best to leave it be." The county clerk, a woman I'd done electrical work for 3 times, looked at me sideways and said, "Marcus, what are you digging into?" My uncle, my own uncle, told me to let it go. He said, "Your mama's doing better. Don't drag her back into that darkness." The evidence was airtight, and every door I looked at had a Ridgecrest lock on it. That feeling, having proof and having no one to give it to, I can't describe how that sits in your chest. And then Nola Burgess called me. Nola's daughter Tessa was in the van that day, the one who fractured her pelvis. Tessa was 27 now, living in Louisville, walking fine but with a permanent limp. Nola was 61, still living on Ivy Hill Road, still attending Ridgecrest Baptist every Sunday. She said, "I heard you've been asking questions about the van. I think we should talk. I want to stop here and ask you something. If you were in my position, you've got evidence, you've got a witness in another state willing to talk, and now someone from inside the congregation is reaching out. Do you push forward, knowing it could tear apart the church your family helped build? Or do you protect the peace? There's no right answer. I'd love to hear where you land. Drop it in the comments. Because the next conversation I had with Nola changed the scale of what I was dealing with completely. Nola Burgess was a small woman with sharp eyes and a voice that didn't waste words. She'd been a school lunch lady for 22 years. She wasn't someone who caused trouble. She was someone who watched. I went to her house on a Thursday evening. She made coffee. We sat at her kitchen table and she said, "I've known since the week after the accident." She didn't say it soft. She said it like she was spitting out something that had been stuck in her throat for a decade. She told me that 2 days after the crash, while Tessa was still in the hospital with her pelvis held together by surgical pins, Nola overheard a conversation in the church parking lot. 2 deacons, she wouldn't give me their names, not yet, talking about the brakes. One of them said, "Leland should have fixed it months ago." The other said, "He couldn't, not with the building fund presentation coming up. Every dollar was spoken for." Nola said she confronted Pastor Greer privately the following week. She went to his office. She told him what she'd heard. And Greer sat behind his desk, folded his hands and said, "Nola, those men were speculating. The accident was caused by Dorsey's driving, not the vehicle. I know how much pain your family is in, and I understand the need to find someone to blame. But pointing fingers at the church won't heal Tessa. It'll only hurt this community." She said she asked him directly, "Was there a problem with the brakes?" And he looked at her and said, "I would never put a child in danger, Nola. You know me." And she believed him. For about 3 months, until she started noticing things. The van was quietly sold in January 2014. No announcement, no vote at the business meeting. Just gone. The maintenance records that used to be kept in the church office? Gone. Dorsey Pruitt? Gone. And every time Nola tried to bring up the accident at a church function, someone would change the subject. Not rudely, just smoothly. Practiced. I said, "Why didn't you push harder?" It came out sharper than I meant. Nola looked at me across the table and her eyes went flat. "Don't you dare," she said. "I was sitting in a hospital room watching my daughter learn to walk again while you were going about your life in that town, same as everybody else. I asked. I got lied to. Same as your mother." She was right. I caught myself. "I'm sorry. I know." Nola's jaw was tight, but she kept going. She said the worst part was realizing she wasn't the only one who knew. You want to know what drove me crazy, Marcus? Watching people put money in the building fund every Sunday and knowing where that money really came from. That fund wasn't built on faith. It was built on shutting up. At least a dozen people in the congregation had heard something, suspected something, or been told directly to stay quiet. But Leland Greer had spent 26 years building a church that this town depended on. Ridgecrest wasn't just a building. It was where people got married, buried their parents, sent their kids to summer camp, found community when they had nothing else. Threatening Ridgecrest was threatening the town itself, and Pastor Greer knew that. He used it. She told me something that made my stomach turn. She said she couldn't look my mother in the eye at church anymore. I'd see Rhonda walk in and I'd look down at my lap. For 11 years, every Sunday. That avoidance gave her headaches that wouldn't stop. 3 years of weekly migraines her doctor couldn't explain. Nola had thought about going to the police 3 times. Each time she talked herself out of it. No evidence. A pastor who denied everything. Tessa was recovering. What good would it do? I showed her the notebook. She read every entry. Then she read them again. Then she put the notebook down on her kitchen table, very carefully, and she said, "I have been carrying this for 11 years. I thought I was the only one who saw it." She wasn't. She was one of many. But she was the first one willing to say it out loud. I sat in my truck after leaving Nola's house and something settled in me. Not anger, something colder, something decided. Silence has weight. I know that now. It's not the absence of words. It's every word a person swallowed instead of speaking. I had the notebook. I had the testimony. I had 11 years of questions and every single answer pointed at the same man. The truth was ready. Now I needed a stage. Over the next month, I built my case. Quietly. I had the notebook, Dorsey's notarized account, Nola's testimony, the insurance lapse, Boyd Creech's statement, and the accident report with no vehicle inspection. I also had something I didn't expect, and it turned something I'd believed about the congregation upside down. I'd been telling myself that the building fund was at least one honest thing about Ridgecrest. The fund had spiked after the crash. $38,000 in donations over 3 months in 2014, almost double the usual rate. I'd thought, at least they came together. Nola set me straight. The biggest single donation in that spike was $15,000 from a man named Gentry Caudle, who owned the gravel company on Route 38. Gentry was a deacon, one of the 2 men Nola heard talking in the parking lot about the brakes 2 days after the crash. A $15,000 gift from a deacon who knew about the brakes, given 4 months after the crash, to a fund that the pastor had been protecting by skipping van repairs and insurance premiums. The generosity I'd been holding on to wasn't generosity. It was the price of keeping quiet. I pulled the building fund records from public filings. The numbers tracked. And the expansion that Pastor Greer had been fundraising for? It broke ground in May 2015. The new fellowship hall opened in October 2016. Total cost? $189,000. Funded entirely by donations, with Gentry Caudle's $15,000 serving as the catalyst. I thought about going to the police, but the sheriff who signed off on the original report had retired in 2019, and his deputy, now acting sheriff, was a Ridgecrest member. I thought about the newspaper. The editor at the Harlan Daily Enterprise sang in the Ridgecrest choir. I thought about the county attorney. His wife taught Sunday school in Greer's church. Every door I looked at had a Ridgecrest lock on it. I called a lawyer in Lexington, a woman who specialized in wrongful death and institutional negligence. She said I had enough for a civil case, probably enough for the county attorney to open a criminal investigation. Reckless homicide. The statute of limitations tolls if fraud or concealment is involved. We were inside the window. She asked me one question. "What do you want to happen?" And I said, "I want every person in that church to hear the truth, from me, in that building." I know some people would have handled this differently, taken it straight to the state police, filed the lawsuit first, and maybe that would have been smarter. But this was Harlan. This was my church. This was the building where my brother sang every Wednesday night. I needed to look these people in the eyes when the truth came out. There was a memorial dinner planned for November 2024. 11 years and 1 month since Eli's death. Ridgecrest held one every year. potluck in the fellowship hall. Pastor Greer always spoke. My mother always went. A ritual of remembrance that, I now understood, was also a ritual of reinforcement. The community gathering to remember Eli and silently reaffirm the story that protected them. I'd heard talk that this might be the last one Greer organized. He'd been mentioning retirement. If he left Harlan, the chance to say it to his face would be gone. I decided that this year, the dinner would be different. I had the notebook. I had the documents. And I had Nola Burgess, who told me she was going to be there, sitting in the second row, ready to speak if I needed her. After everything I've told you, I want to know, what do you think happened at that dinner? What do you think Pastor Greer did when I stood up with the notebook? Did he try to talk his way out? Did he walk out? Or did he sit there and take it? Tell me your prediction in the comments. Because I had prepared for anger. I had prepared for denial. I had not prepared for what actually came out of Leland Greer's mouth. I let that thought sit for a moment. One breath. Steady. November 16th, 2024. Saturday evening. The fellowship hall at Ridgecrest Baptist. The same room Pastor Greer built with the money he saved by not fixing the van that killed my brother. I got there early. Helped my mother carry in a dish. Green bean casserole, Eli's favorite. Folding tables with tablecloths. Paper plates, a banner that said, "In loving memory of Eli Holloway," in blue letters. Maybe 90, 100 people. More than usual, the church had promoted it heavily because it was also the anniversary of the new fellowship hall. Pastor Greer had planned to unveil a plaque. I wore a button-down shirt. I had the notebook in my inside jacket pocket. A folder with copies of the insurance documents, the accident report, Boyd Creech's written statement, and Dorsey Pruitt's notarized account in a bag under my chair. Nola was in the second row. She caught my eye when I walked in. She didn't smile, she just nodded. One small nod. Pastor Greer stood up at 6:30. He walked to the front of the room, stood behind the little wooden podium they used for announcements, and began his remarks. He talked about Eli. He talked about the youth program. He talked about how God uses tragedy to build character. He said, Eli Holloway's legacy is this room, this building, this community that came together in grief and built something lasting. My brother's death was the legacy. The building fund it protected was the legacy. He said that. I waited until he finished. People clapped. He stepped back from the podium, and I stood up. My mother looked at me. She didn't know exactly what I was going to do. I hadn't told her the details, but she knew something was coming. She'd asked me in the car on the way over, "Marcus, should I be worried?" And I'd said, "No, Mama, I'm just going to tell the truth." I walked to the podium. Pastor Greer was still standing off to the side. He looked at me, confused at first, then something shifted. I saw it. A flicker. Not fear yet. Awareness. I said, "I'd like to say something about my brother." The room was quiet. People expected grief, an emotional tribute. I took out the notebook. This is a maintenance log for the church van. The van that crashed on Bailey's Grade on October 19th, 2013. The van that killed my brother Eli. I opened it to the first flagged entry. August 14th, 2013. Right rear brake making grinding sound. Told Pastor G. He said budget won't cover it until after the building fund presentation in November. I heard someone in the back of the room inhale sharply. I kept going. August 29th. Brake issue worse. Passengers can feel pulling on right turns. Told Pastor G again. He said use the other vehicle for long trips. September 22nd. Brakes very soft on Bailey's Grade. Almost missed the turn at the bottom. Quote, I am not comfortable driving this vehicle with passengers. October 11th. 8 days before my brother died. Quote, told Pastor G I will not drive the van with youth passengers until brakes are fixed. He said he would take care of it. I looked up. The room was frozen. I mean, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I could hear the fluorescent lights humming above us. Pastor Greer was standing 4 feet to my left. His face was, I don't know how to describe it. Not angry, not scared. It was blank, like a screen that had gone dark. I reached into my bag and took out the folder. The church's liability insurance lapsed on September 1st, 2013, 6 weeks before the crash. Annual premium, $4,100. Pastor Greer redirected those funds to the building fund. Someone said, "Oh my God." I think it was Brenda Goines. Boyd Creech at Boyd's Auto told Pastor Greer in July 2013 that the brake pads were almost gone. There is no record of any repair being scheduled or performed. The accident report, case number 13-HC-4471, lists driver error as the cause. There was no vehicle inspection after the crash, no brake assessment, no mechanical review. I put the folder on the podium. I looked at Greer. "Dorsey Pruitt didn't lose control of the van, Pastor. The brakes failed. You knew they would. And you sent those kids out anyway because you couldn't afford to fix them and keep your building fund on schedule." Greer opened his mouth, and what came out, I'll never forget it. He said, "Marcus, I understand you're in pain, but you're taking a maintenance log and constructing a narrative that—" Nola Burgess stood up. "I heard Gentry Caudill and Warren Akers talking about the brakes in the parking lot 2 days after the crash. I confronted you in your office, Leland. You told me I was looking for someone to blame." The room erupted. Not yelling. More of a collective gasp that became murmuring, that became people standing up, looking at each other, looking at Greer. Greer's hands were shaking. I could see them from where I stood. He gripped the edge of the table next to him. He said, "This church has served this community for—" "My brother was 16. That's all I said. He stopped. He looked at me. And for half a second, maybe less, something crossed his face. Not guilt, not shame. Something older, something exhausted. And then it was gone, and the mask came back, and he straightened his shoulders and said, "I have given everything to this church and this town. Everything. And I will not stand here and be accused by a man reading from a notebook he found in a basement." My mother stood up. Rhonda Holloway, who had sat in this church for 30 years, who had buried her husband and her son and never once raised her voice in public, looked at Pastor Leland Greer and said, "You told me not to go looking for more pain. You said that to my face while you knew my boy died because you wouldn't spend $1,800 on brake pads." The room went silent. Not the murmuring kind, the absolute kind. What happened after that? I've played it back in my head 100 times. It still doesn't feel real. Greer walked out of the fellowship hall without another word. He pushed through the side door into the parking lot and drove away in his truck. 3 people followed him out. Everyone else stayed. For about 5 minutes, nobody knew what to do. People were standing, sitting, some were crying. Brenda Goines came up to me and said, "Marcus, is all of that true?" I pointed at the folder on the podium and said, "Every document is right there." Within an hour, 17 people in that room had looked at the folder, the notebook, the insurance record, Boyd Creech's statement, Dorsey's notarized account. Some of them read it and walked away without speaking. Some of them broke down. One woman, I won't say her name because she didn't give me permission, grabbed my arm and said, I knew since 2014 and I never said anything, and I am so sorry." I walked out the side door, the same one Greer had used. The parking lot was half empty by then. I got to my truck and leaned against the driver's side door. My hands were shaking. I pressed my forehead against the cold metal and let everything go. Everything I'd been holding in that room. Everything I'd been holding for 14 months. A sound came out of me that I didn't recognize. Something that had been locked in my chest since the day I sat on that basement floor with Dorsey's notebook in my hands. I pulled myself together before my mother came out, wiped my face, straightened up. She found me by the truck and she didn't say anything. She just put her hand on my arm and we stood there in the parking lot for a while, not talking. The next Monday, I drove to the Harlan County Attorney's office with my lawyer from Lexington. We presented everything. The county attorney reviewed the documents for 2 days. Then he called my lawyer and said the evidence was strong, but he wanted to flag a concern: the statute of limitations. My lawyer laid out the fraud and concealment tolling provision under Kentucky law, the deliberate cover-up, the destroyed maintenance records, Dorsey's paid departure, the lapsed insurance hidden from the congregation. All of it constituted active concealment that paused the clock. The county attorney agreed and referred the case to the Kentucky State Police the following day. Within 2 weeks, a criminal investigation was opened into reckless homicide and fraud. Gentry Caudill, the deacon who donated $15,000 to the building fund, was interviewed by state investigators. He confirmed that he knew about the brake issue before the crash. He said he made the donation because Leland asked me to help the church get through a difficult time. He was not charged, but his statement corroborated everything. Pastor Leland Greer was arrested on December 14, 2024, 2 days before his 60th birthday, charged with reckless homicide and second-degree fraud. His bail was set at $75,000. He posted it the same night. The church held an emergency business meeting the following week. 211 members attended, the largest gathering in Ridgecrest's history. They voted 184 to 27 to remove Pastor Greer from his position. The 27 who voted to keep him, most were older members, people who'd been at Ridgecrest since before Greer arrived, people whose marriages and funerals and baptisms were all tied to that one man. A few told my mother they still didn't believe it. Some, I think, just couldn't face what believing it would mean. 26 years of ministry ended in a 15-minute vote. Dorsey Pruitt was not charged. The county attorney determined that he had reported the mechanical issue to his superior and was directed to drive by his employer. He cooperated fully with the investigation. Last I heard, he was still in Terre Haute. I called him after the arrest to tell him. He didn't say much. He just said, "Thank you for finding that notebook." The civil suit was filed in January 2025. My family and Nola Burgess's family as co-plaintiffs. $2.3 million in damages against Leland Greer personally and Ridgecrest Baptist Church's insurance carrier, or rather, the lack of one. The church's current carrier refused to cover incidents predating their policy. The case is still pending. Boyd Creech came to my shop on Central Street the week after the arrest. He's 71 years old. He stood in my doorway and he said, "I told him about those brakes. I told him in July. I should have done more. I told him it wasn't his fault." He nodded, but I don't think he believed me. That was 4 months ago. I'm still in Harlan, still running Holloway Electric, still driving past Ridgecrest Baptist every morning on my way to the shop. The building looks the same. They hired an interim pastor from Pineville. Young guy, early 30s. I don't know him. My mother goes back to church now. Not Ridgecrest. She started attending a small Baptist congregation in Cumberland. She told me it's different, smaller. The pastor's wife brings her pie on Wednesdays. She said it feels honest. I don't know if she'll ever fully trust a church again, but she's trying. That matters to me. Last Wednesday I stopped by her house after work. She was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, and when I came up the steps, she reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a photograph. Eli at 14, standing in front of the church van, holding a box of canned goods and grinning so wide you could see the gap where he'd lost a tooth playing basketball. She said, "I found this in a drawer. I want you to have it." I put it in my wallet. It's still there. Nola Burgess and I have dinner at Brenda's Diner every other Thursday. We don't always talk about the case. Sometimes we talk about Tessa's new job in Louisville, or the weather, or the fact that the diner changed their cornbread recipe and it's not as good. But sometimes we sit there and we don't talk at all, and that's fine too. There's something about being around someone who carried the same weight you did. You don't need to explain. The town is different now. I won't pretend it's all healed. Some people thank me. Some people cross the street when they see me. I lost 2 commercial clients after the arrest, both Ridgecrest families. I gained 4 new ones from people in Everts and Cumberland who said they'd been watching. The net math works out, but it's not really about math. I went to Eli's grave last month, March. The ground was still cold. I sat there for a while. I told him I found the notebook, told him what happened, told him about Mama going to the new church, told him his green bean casserole still got made every November. I don't know. You carry something like this for 11 years, and when you finally put it down, you expect to feel lighter. And you do, mostly. But there's a different weight now. The weight of knowing what your neighbors are capable of staying quiet about. The weight of knowing that the building where you sang hymns as a kid was built on your brother's grave. Truth doesn't make everything right. It just makes things real. And real is where I'd rather live. It's a Saturday morning, early June. I'm sitting on the porch of my house on Clover Fork Road with a cup of coffee that's going cold because I keep forgetting to drink it. The mountain's green again. You can hear the creek from here if the wind's right. My phone rings sometimes and I pick it up without that sick feeling I used to get. I drive to work and I don't check my rearview mirror every 30 seconds. I sleep through the night most nights. Not all, but most. That's new. Last week I heard that Leland Greer has been staying at his sister's place in London, Kentucky, 60 miles from Harlan. Not allowed back at Ridgecrest pending the trial. His wife moved out in February. He's 60 years old, living in his sister's guest room, waiting for a court date. No pulpit, no congregation. No one calling to ask what he thinks about the zoning dispute on Route 421. I didn't plan that. I didn't want that, specifically. But I'd be lying if I said I don't think about it. If you stayed with me through this whole thing, all of it, from the notebook to the dinner to where I'm sitting right now, I want to thank you. I mean that. This was the hardest story I've ever had to tell, and I've been carrying it alone for a long time. Having someone listen to the whole thing, start to finish, without walking away or changing the subject, that's something I didn't get in Harlan for 11 years. So thank you. If this story hit you in a way that matters, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you're not already. These stories don't reach people unless they get shared. And I think there are people out there who need to hear that silence doesn't protect anyone. It just delays the damage. I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a community, a church, a workplace, a family, where everybody knew something was wrong, but nobody would say it? What finally broke the silence? Or is it still going? I'd love to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. You don't have to use names. Just tell me what happened. If you want more stories, there's one playing right after this. It's worth your time. You know what I keep thinking about? Eli would have been 27 this year. He'd have probably still been organizing food drives. Some people just, they don't stop helping. That was him. That was always him. I'm Marcus Holloway. I'm 34. I live in Harlan, Kentucky, and I'm not looking away anymore.